My husband left two wills, one for the world and one for me. The first gave his mother our house. The second gave me the truth that would destroy her. Before Robert, my life was catalogued. It was quiet, ordered, and smelled of aging paper and binding glue. As an archivist for the university, I lived in the gentle hum of climate-controlled rooms, my companions the silent, brittle ghosts of the past. I found comfort in the tangible echoes of history, the faded ink of a Civil War soldier's letter, the ghostly impression of a fingerprint on a 19th century photograph, the delicate cartography of a forgotten map. My world was flat, two-dimensional, written in script that required a magnifying glass to decipher. I was a curator of other people's lives, a guardian of stories that had already reached their conclusion. I was safe there in the silence. I preferred the company of the dead. They were so much less complicated than the living. Then I met Robert Vance. He was like a historical text come to life. Where I saw history as a collection of preserved artifacts, he saw it as a living, breathing entity. His family's legacy wasn't something stored in boxes. It was in the floorboards of the house he grew up in the portraits whose eyes followed you down the hall, in the stories he told with such vibrant, infectious passion. He was the keeper of his family's flame, and when he looked at me, he didn't see a quiet, solitary woman who preferred books to people. He saw a fellow keeper. He saw that my reverence for the past was the same as his, just expressed in a different language. He used to say I was the only person who understood the grammar of his family. He'd find me in the library of the Vance estate, our library, running my fingers over the spines of his ancestors' journals, and he'd smile. He knew I wasn't just looking at books. I was listening to them. Marrying him wasn't just a union of two people. For me, it was like stepping through a portal, from the flat page into a three-dimensional world. I left the sterile, controlled environment of the university archives and entered a living one. The Vance home. It wasn't a house. It was a testament. A sprawling Gothic revival mansion on the Massachusetts coast, a labyrinth of dark wood, faded tapestries, and secrets soaked into the plaster. I learned its rhythms, its groans, the way the light fell across the oriental rugs in the late afternoon. I memorized the faces of his ancestors, their triumphs and their scandals. I wasn't just his wife. I became the house's student, its caretaker, and its most devoted resident. My love for that place wasn't about ownership. It was about preservation. I finally had a story of my own to archive, one that was still being written. I believed I had found my place. I was no longer an observer of history. I was a part of it. Of course, there was Eleonora, Robert's mother, the matriarch. To the historical societies, the charity boards, and the old money fossils of our town, Eleonora was a paragon of civic virtue and ancestral pride. She was the fierce protector of the Vance legacy, a woman who wore her heritage like a suit of finely wrought armor. Her public face was a masterpiece of practiced grace and quiet dignity. But a historian, a true archivist, learns to look for the story beneath the official record. You learn to spot the forgeries, the omissions, the carefully curated narratives designed to hide a less palatable truth. From the moment Robert introduced us, I was an anomaly she could not categorize, and therefore could not tolerate. In her eyes, I wasn't family. I was a foreign organism introduced into a sterile environment, a contaminant in the pristine Vance bloodline. Her contempt was never overt. It was in the subtle tightening of her smile when I entered a room. The way she'd correct my pronunciation of a French ancestor's name. The helpful suggestions that my style of dress was perhaps a little too simple for a Vance woman. She spoke to me with the condescending patience of a curator explaining a priceless artifact to a child, making it clear that I could look, but I must never, ever touch. Robert saw it. He deflected it with practiced ease, a gentle joke here, a protective arm around my waist there. He was the buffer between her world and mine. "She's just protective of the family name, Lena," he would say. "She thinks it's made of glass." I didn't know it then, but he understood her in a way I couldn't. He knew her key vulnerability, the fatal flaw in her design. Her fanatical, all-consuming belief that the family's legitimacy, the purity of its blood, was its only true source of power. It was the central pillar supporting the entire cathedral of her identity. If that pillar were ever to crack, the whole magnificent structure would come crashing down. I just never imagined I would be the one to light the fuse. Robert's death was sudden. A heart that had beaten so strong and so warm for 42 years just stopped. The world didn't just stop with it. It shattered. The silence he left behind was immense, a deafening roar that filled every corner of our home. Grief is a disorienting fog. You lose all sense of time, of direction. You're adrift in a cold, gray sea. But the fog eventually clears. And when it did, I found that the world I was left with was not the one he and I had built together. It was a hostile, alien landscape, and I was a trespasser. The true horror began in the suffocating days that followed the funeral. While I was numbly picking out a casket, Eleonora was meeting with a locksmith. While I was writing his eulogy, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen, she was drafting an eviction notice. She didn't wait. She didn't even grant me the dignity of a week's mourning. The predator, I've learned, always strikes at the moment of maximum weakness. I came back from the funeral home, my soul scraped raw, my mind a blur of condolences and casseroles. I remember walking up the stone path, the crunch of gravel under my shoes the only sound in the world. I reached for my key, the same key I'd used 1,000 times. The key Robert had placed in my hand the day we moved in, saying, "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance." It slid into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it, my confusion slowly curdling into a cold, sickening dread. The door opened. But it wasn't me who opened it. It was Eleonora. She stood there, framed in the doorway of my home, dressed in immaculate black. Her expression wasn't one of sympathy. It was one of finality. "Eleonora? What's going on?" "My key won't work." She looked at the brass key in my hand as if it were a dead insect. "That's because the locks have been changed, dear," she said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "For security, of course. In this transitional period." Transitional period. The phrase hung in the air between us, sterile and cruel. "I don't understand," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "Robert's passing is a tragedy," she said, her eyes devoid of any emotion I could recognize as grief. "But the house, the family, must be secured. It's what he would have wanted." She stepped aside slightly, not as an invitation, but as a gesture of command. "One of the staff will escort you upstairs to pack your personal belongings. I've had boxes sent to your room." Your room. Not our room. In the space of a single sentence, my marriage had been edited, my existence redacted. I stood there on the porch, my eulogy for my husband folded in my pocket, and realized I was already a ghost in my own life. The crime wasn't just the seizure of property. It was the systematic, cold-blooded erasure of my history, of my place in the story. She was telling me I was nothing more than a footnote in the grand saga of the Vances, a temporary character whose role had come to an end. She was ripping my pages out of the book. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. She informed the family lawyer, a man whose firm had been on the Vance payroll since the Great Depression, that I was emotionally unstable, overwrought with grief, and incapable of managing the estate. She planted seeds of doubt with surgical precision. To the outside world, she was the grieving matriarch, bravely holding her family together. I was the hysterical, grasping widow. It was a narrative as old as time and just as effective. Then came the reading of the will. We sat in the lawyer's mahogany-paneled office, the air thick with the smell of old money and feigned sorrow. Robert's cousins, his aunts and uncles, the entire Vance clan was assembled. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I was the outsider, the appendix. Eleonora sat at the head of the table, a black veil partially obscuring her face, the very picture of tragic dignity. The lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat and read the document in a dry monotone. It was straightforward. A few bequests to distant relatives, some charitable donations, and then the final pronouncement. The Vance estate, including the ancestral home and all its contents, was to be left to his beloved mother, Eleonora Vance. For me, there was a trust. Generous, the lawyer called it. Enough to ensure my comfort for the rest of my life. It sounded like a kindness, but I knew what it was. It was severance pay. It was the price of my silence, the gilded cage meant to hold the inconvenient widow. Eleonora's lawyers moved immediately. The formal eviction papers arrived the next day. Any attempt I made to contest the will was met with an impenetrable wall of legal might. Mr. Abernathy explained with paternalistic condescension that Robert's wishes were perfectly clear. To challenge them would be unseemly. It would drag the family name through the mud. It would be a betrayal of Robert's memory. They used my love for him as a weapon against me. The system, I quickly learned, was not designed for justice. It was designed to protect power. And in that world, Eleonora was the state, and I was a stateless refugee. The family closed ranks around her, the town whispered. The poor woman, losing her only son. And now his wife is making things so difficult. She was never really one of us, you know. I was completely, utterly alone. The law couldn't help me. The family had abandoned me. My grief was now compounded by a blinding, impotent rage. This wasn't just an injustice. It was a desecration. She wasn't just taking a house. She was taking my memories, poisoning the well of my past until every happy moment I'd shared with Robert there was tainted by her victory. Realized that formal justice, the kind dispensed in courtrooms and written on parchment, was a fantasy. To get justice for Robert, to reclaim my own story, I would have to find a truth more powerful than Eleonora's money, more absolute than her influence. A truth the system, for all its power, would be forced to acknowledge. My last day in the house was a blur of cardboard boxes and ghosts. I was allowed 3 hours, with a grim-faced housekeeper appointed by Eleonora watching my every move, ensuring I didn't take any family heirlooms. I moved through the rooms that had been my sanctuary, now a cold, hostile museum. I packed my clothes, my books, the few photographs that were more mine than theirs. I felt a profound sense of defeat. She had won. My final stop was the library. Robert's armchair. A deep, worn leather chair where he'd spent countless hours reading. I ran my hand over the armrest, my heart aching with a pain so sharp it was physical, and my fingers brushed against something. A lump in the upholstery, right at the back where the cushion met the frame. My heart stuttered. I felt around, my fingers finding the edge of a small, crisp envelope. I pulled it out. It was thick, heavy paper. On the front, in my husband's familiar, elegant script, was a single word. Lena. The housekeeper cleared her throat. "Your time is almost up, madam." I slipped the envelope into my pocket, my hand trembling. I took one last look at the room, at the life that had been stolen from me, and walked out without looking back. Later that night, in the sterile anonymity of a hotel room, I opened it. Inside there was no letter. Just 2 items. A small, ornate, antique key, one I had never seen before, and a simple black USB drive. I stared at them, my mind racing. This was a message, a secret. This was Robert, reaching out from beyond the silence. I plugged the drive into my laptop. A single video file appeared on the screen. I clicked it, and there he was, my Robert. He looked tired, paler than I remembered, the sickness already taking hold in ways I hadn't allowed myself to see. But his eyes were sharp, clear, and focused directly on me. He was in his library, in his armchair. A fire crackled in the hearth behind him. "Lena," he began, his voice a balm on my shattered soul. "My Lena, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and it means my mother has done exactly what I feared she would." He took a slow breath. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I had to do this. The will, the one Abernathy read, that was a performance. It was for her. A story I had to write to ensure she wouldn't fight me in my final months. But this," he held up a key, the twin of the one in my hand, "this is the truth. And it's for you. She believes this family's power is in its blood, in its name, in the walls of that house. She's wrong. Its real power, its real history is hidden, and she is its most zealous, its most unwitting guardian. She'll try to erase you, my love. The only way to stop her is not to fight for the house. It's to correct the historical record. He leaned closer to the camera, his gaze intense, loving, and filled with a burning purpose. I've left you a map, Lena. A trail of breadcrumbs only an archivist could follow. Only you. The will gives her the house. But the truth gives you her soul. Find it. For me. The video ended. The screen went dark. But in the reflection, I could see my own face. The grief was still there, a permanent stain on my soul. But it was no longer the defining feature. Beneath it, a new layer was forming. Harder, sharper, colder. It was the calm, methodical focus of an archivist with a new collection to acquire, a story to uncover, a history to rewrite. Eleonora had taken my home. She had tried to erase my future. But my husband had just given me a key to her past. And I was going to use it to burn her world to the ground. He had built me a labyrinth of secrets, knowing I was the only one who could navigate it. The game was set. The rules were his, but the victory would be mine. My husband was a historian, and he knew his subject better than anyone. His subject was his mother, Eleonora. He knew that upon his death, she would treat me like an inconvenient footnote in the family saga, a character to be written out. And she did. She locked me out of my home, my life, and my memories, using a will that left her everything as her justification. The law, the family, the entire world sided with the grieving matriarch. I was left with nothing, but Robert was a better historian than she gave him credit for. He left a second will, a true will, just for me. It was a video message, a key, and a promise. A promise that the carefully curated history Eleonora had built her life upon was a lie. He left me a map to find the truth, knowing my skills as an archivist were the only thing that could unearth a secret buried for 75 years. He tasked me with correcting the historical record. My grief became my fuel. My purpose became cold, clear, and absolute. An archivist's first task is to assess the collection, to understand its scope, its language, its biases. My collection was a single video file, 6 minutes and 42 seconds of my dead husband's voice. I transcribed every word. I timed every pause. I noted every flicker of his eyes, every subtle inflection. It was the primary source document of my new life. Most of it was a loving goodbye. Words meant to comfort me that now felt like embers I could press against my skin to remind myself to keep going. But threaded through the love were the clues. The first one was the key. He called it the key to the first chapter. And the first chapter, he said, began with a failed rebellion in the library. The failed rebellion. It was one of the many stories in the Vance family catechism, a tale Robert's grandfather used to tell. In the 1920s, a disgruntled great-uncle, furious over some inheritance slight, had supposedly tried to burn the family records in the library fireplace. He was stopped, the records were saved, and he was written out of the family Bible. Eleonora always told the story with a theatrical shudder, a cautionary tale about the dangers of emotional incontinence and disrespect for one's heritage. To her, it was a story about the triumph of order. But Robert's emphasis on it, the way he'd said the word failed, suggested a different interpretation. He wasn't pointing me to the story. He was pointing me to the location. The fireplace. But to get to the fireplace, I had to get back into the house. My prison, my former life. Walking up to the front door was impossible. I was persona non grata, the mad widow clawing at the gates. I needed a ghost entrance, and for that, I had to rely on the part of my knowledge that wasn't in any book, Eleonora's habits. Her life was a clockwork of meticulously scheduled events. Tuesday, 2 p.m., garden club. Thursday, 7 p.m., Historical Society board meeting. And Friday, from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. For the last 30 years, her bridge game with the 3 other harpies of the town's upper crust. The house would be empty, save for the housekeeper, who spent those 3 hours listening to talk radio in the kitchen at the far end of the West Wing. Security was a concept for the outside world. Eleanor's arrogance was her alarm system. She never imagined anyone would have the audacity to trespass on her hallowed ground, especially me. I used the first withdrawal from Robert's generous trust to buy a set of lockpicks and a subscription to an online instructional course. The irony was delicious. Her money was buying me the tools to dismantle her. For 2 weeks, in my sterile apartment, I practiced on padlocks and deadbolts. My archivist's hands, so used to delicate, patient work, learning a new, more aggressive dexterity. Failure was a series of frustrating clicks and scrapes. Success was a quiet, satisfying snick. The day I chose was overcast and gray, the sky the color of slate. It provided good cover. I parked 2 streets away and walked, my heart a cold, heavy drum against my ribs. The house loomed at the end of the drive, a Gothic giant sleeping in the misty afternoon. It looked different now. Not a home, but a fortress. A repository. I didn't feel nostalgia. I felt like a scholar entering a hostile archive. The entrance I chose was a small service door in the cellar, hidden behind a lattice of overgrown ivy. It was old, rarely used, the lock a simple tumbler. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The picks felt clumsy, alien. The housekeeper's radio drifted faintly from the other side of the house, a tinny, mundane sound in the midst of my life's most dramatic moment. For a full minute, nothing happened. The lock held firm. I felt a surge of panic, the thought of failure a bitter taste in my mouth. Patience, I told myself. You are an archivist. This is just a damaged document. Find the point of weakness. I took a breath, exhaled, and tried again, applying the lessons from my online tutor. The tension, the counter-tension, and then the soft, beautiful snick. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, opening into cool darkness that smelled of damp earth and coal dust. I was in. I moved through the house like a phantom. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, was a thunderclap in the silence. I was a trespasser in my own memories. I saw the indentation on the sofa where Robert and I used to sit, the faint water ring on a side table from a glass I'd forgotten to put a coaster under. They were artifacts of a life that no longer existed. I pushed the ghosts away. I had a job to do. The library was just as I'd left it, a shrine to a man Eleonora was now systematically editing for public consumption. The air was still, heavy with the scent of beeswax and leather. I went directly to the fireplace. It was a cavernous thing of black marble, large enough to stand in. I knelt, my hands running over the intricate brickwork inside, searching. Robert's clue was precise. A failed rebellion, an act of passion, of anger. The great-uncle would have been standing, furious, perhaps having thrown something into the flames. His eye level. I stood up and ran my fingers along the bricks about 5 feet up. One of them shifted. A faint grinding movement. My breath caught. I pressed harder and the brick pivoted inward, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. My hands, trembling again, reached inside. My fingers closed around a small, heavy packet wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. I pulled it out. It was heavy for its size. I didn't open it. Not there. The archive could not be compromised. I slipped the brick back into place, slid the packet into my bag, and left the way I came, a silent ghost leaving a silent tomb. Back in the sterile safety of my apartment, I unwrapped my prize. It was a bundle of about a dozen letters, the paper yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. They were written by Robert's grandfather, Arthur Vance, to his brother, who lived overseas. The dates spanned a single year, 1948, the year of Eleonora's birth. The letters were not a confession. They were a portrait of a man's despair, painted in coded language. He never mentioned a child's death. He never mentioned an adoption, but he wrote of a great and terrible shadow that had fallen over the family. He wrote of his wife, Robert's grandmother, being consumed by a phantom grief from which she might never recover. In one letter, dated just weeks after Eleonora's official birth date, he wrote something that made the hairs on my arm stand up. "We have a cuckoo in the nest, brother. She sings a pretty song, but the nest is not her own, and the rightful songbird is gone forever. A cuckoo. A bird that lays its egg in another's nest, tricking the parents into raising its young. It was a breadcrumb, but a vital one. It confirmed a deception, but it wasn't proof. It was the emotional, biased testimony of a grieving man. Legally, it was meaningless. I felt a surge of frustration. I had the smoke, but Eleonora had hidden the gun perfectly. I tried the official channels. I spent weeks attempting to access birth and death records from the county archives for the winter of 1948. Every request was denied. The records were sealed by family request, or they were in processing, or in one infuriating case, they had been lost in a clerical fire in 1972. It was a fortress of bureaucracy, and the Vance name was the key to every gate, a key I no longer possessed. Eleonora's power wasn't just in her wealth. It was woven into the very fabric of the town's institutions. I was trying to fight a ghost in her own haunted house. The system that had failed me after Robert's death was continuing to fail me now. This was a lesson. I couldn't rely on outside sources. Robert knew that. The entire map, every clue, had to be contained within the Vance collection itself. I returned to the video, the primary source. I watched it again and again, dozens of times. I was looking for a new clue, something I had missed. And I found it, in a place I hadn't thought to look. It wasn't in his words of instruction, but in his words of love. He was reminiscing about one of our first dates, a walk through the estate gardens. And I told you the story of Great-Aunt Cecily. His voice on the recording was warm with the memory, and her lost constellation. How she swore she'd discovered a new star cluster with her telescope, but no one believed her. You loved that story. I did love that story. Eleonora would tell it at dinner parties as a charming family anecdote. Cecily, the eccentric spinster aunt, a clumsy but passionate amateur astronomer who spent her nights on the widow's walk with a brass telescope. A sweet, harmless story. But Robert's voice, the specific way he'd said lost constellation, it wasn't nostalgia. It was a signpost. Another coded message. My mind raced, connecting the threads on my wall. Great-Aunt Cecily. The attic where her belongings were stored. The year 1948 when the shadow had fallen. The lost constellation story was always set in that same winter. It wasn't a story about the stars. It was a cover story. It was a carefully crafted piece of family lore designed to explain why Cecily was in the attic, night after night, with a telescope. But what if she wasn't looking up at the sky? What if she was looking out at the town? Or at a specific building? The key. The ornate antique key Robert had left me. It wasn't for the cellar door. I knew with a sudden chilling certainty that it was the key to Cecily's trunk. Getting back into the house a second time was harder. The first success had made me confident, but now the risks felt greater. I was closer to the heart of the labyrinth, and I could feel the presence of the Minotaur. But the routine was the same. Friday, 1 p.m., the bridge game. The housekeeper's radio. The cellar door. This time I moved with more purpose, less fear. I went straight for the attic stairs, a narrow, winding flight hidden behind a door in a linen closet. The attic was Eleonora's blind spot. She curated the main floors of the house with obsessive detail, but the attic was a tomb of discarded history. It smelled of dust, cedar, and time itself. I found Cecily's trunk in a far corner. It was a large, steamer-style trunk bound in brass with the initials CV stamped on the lid. My heart hammered as I pulled the key from my pocket. It slid into the lock. I turned it. A loud, grinding clunk echoed in the silence. It opened. The top layer was exactly what the family story promised. Star charts, astronomy logs, books on celestial navigation. A perfect prop, but I knew there was more. I felt along the inside lining of the lid, my fingers searching for an imperfection, a seam, anything. And I found it. A slight ripple in the velvet. I pressed, and a false panel popped open, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. My breath hitched. Inside was not a diary, not a letter, but a collection of official-looking documents bound with a faded pink ribbon, and a single small photograph. I lifted them into a sliver of dusty sunlight. The first document was a hospital record from St. Jude's Mercy Hospital, dated December 1948. It recorded the birth of a daughter, Eleanora Mae Vance, to Arthur and Beatrice Vance, and stamped across the bottom, in stark red ink, were 2 words, "Infant deceased." My blood ran cold. The next document was a death certificate. Eleanora Mae Vance. Cause of death? Respiratory failure. Lived 7 hours. Then, a baptismal certificate from the St. Giles Foundling Home, an orphanage on the edge of town that had burned down in the 50s. It recorded the baptism of a nameless infant girl found on their steps. Date: November 1948. And finally, a private adoption record, signed by a priest and Robert's grandfather, Arthur. It recorded the adoption of the nameless foundling by Arthur and Beatrice Vance. The date was 2 days after their own daughter had died. The photograph was of 2 nurses holding a swaddled baby. On the back, in Cecily's spidery handwriting, was a single sentence. They gave her the dead baby's name. This was it. The truth. The historical record corrected. The woman who had built her entire identity on the sacred purity of the Vance bloodline had not a single drop of it in her veins. She was a foundling, an orphan, a replacement, the cuckoo in the nest. Great Aunt Cecily hadn't been looking at the stars. She had been a witness. She had documented the lie, hiding the proof in plain sight under the cover of a charming, eccentric hobby. I sat there, in the dusty silence of the attic, the truth in my hands. I should have felt triumphant, victorious. But what I felt was a profound, hollow emptiness. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The entire Vance family history, the legacy that Robert had cherished, the story I had married into, was a fraud. It was all built on a foundation of grief and deception. And as I sat there, the weight of this secret settling upon me, I felt a new kind of despair. Eleanora hadn't just been cruel to me. Her entire life had been an act of desperate, terrified performance. She wasn't just protecting a legacy, she was protecting her own fragile, fabricated existence. To expose her wasn't just to defeat an enemy, it was to annihilate a human being. That's when I heard it. A car door slamming shut outside. I froze. I checked my watch. 3:45 p.m. The bridge game should have gone on for another 15 minutes. They were early. Footsteps echoed from the ground floor. A voice. Eleanora's voice, sharp and clear. I thought I heard something upstairs. Check the attic. Panic, cold, and absolute seized me. I was trapped. I was in her house, in her attic, holding the evidence that would destroy her, and her footsteps were on the stairs. I had found the truth, but I was about to lose everything else. In that dusty attic, with her footsteps drawing closer, I realized this was no longer about a house or a name. It was about survival. Robert had left me a map, and I followed it into the heart of his family's darkness. The first clue led me to my own library, to a fireplace hiding the whispers of a 75-year-old secret, a cuckoo in the nest. The second clue, hidden in a memory of a story about the stars, led me to an attic full of ghosts. There, using the key he'd left me, I opened the trunk of a long-dead woman who had been the silent witness to a terrible lie. I found the truth, preserved on brittle paper, a death certificate for the real Eleanora Vance, and adoption papers for the woman who stole her name. I had found the weapon Robert had promised me. But in the moment of discovery, my enemy found me. I was trapped in the attic, the proof clutched in my hand, listening to the sound of Eleanora's footsteps coming up the stairs to reclaim the secret I had just stolen. Panic is a blinding white light. It erases thought, leaving only the screaming instinct to survive. My mind went blank. The footsteps were on the landing now. A hand rattled the old brass knob. The door was locked from the inside. A flimsy slide bolt the only thing between me and discovery. "It's bolted," a man's voice, the groundskeeper, muttered from the other side. Eleanora's voice, sharp as broken glass. "Then break it down. Now." That command, so full of her absolute, unquestioning authority, broke my paralysis. The archivist, the quiet scholar, vanished. Someone else took over. Someone colder. The thud of a shoulder hitting the door was the starting pistol. I scrambled backward, away from the sound, my eyes darting around the forest of shrouded furniture. There was no escape. No window, no other door. My eyes fell on a dark square of wood set into the wall near the floor. The dumbwaiter, a relic from a bygone era, sealed shut for decades. It was a tomb. It was a chance. I threw myself at it, my fingers searching for a latch, a handle, anything. There was only a small keyhole-shaped indentation. It was a prayer answered in brass. The key, Robert's key. The key that had opened Cecily's trunk. He knew. He knew every secret of this house, every escape route. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the key. The wood of the attic door splintered. Another slam. The key slid into the dumbwaiter lock. It turned. The door swung open into a pitch-black shaft that smelled of rot and dead air. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the precious documents down the front of my shirt, the brittle paper crinkling against my skin, and squeezed myself into the tiny wooden box. It was a coffin. My shoulders were pinned, my knees jammed against my chest. I reached out, found the thick, greasy rope of the pulley system and pulled. Nothing. It was stuck, frozen by decades of disuse. The attic door crashed open. I could hear them stepping inside. I pulled again with a guttural sob of pure, primal fear. The rope groaned, shuddered, and then, with an agonizing screech of wood on wood, the dumbwaiter began to descend. I plunged into darkness, the sounds from the attic fading above me. The descent was a nightmare of scraping wood, falling dust, and the terror of the rope snapping. I passed the second floor, then the first, and finally jolted to a stop in the cavernous silence of the basement pantry. I scrambled out, filthy, shaking, my heart a wild bird in my chest. I didn't look back. I fled through the cellar, out the service door, and didn't stop running until the gray familiarity of my own street was beneath my feet. Back in my apartment, the adrenaline gave way to a violent, soul-shaking tremor. I laid the documents out on my table, my hands shaking so badly I could barely handle them. I had the truth. I had escaped. But the sheer, brutal terror of that near capture had changed something in me. My quiet, academic quest for justice now felt like a street fight. The close call solidified my resolve into something diamond-hard. Eleonora's paranoia, her immediate instinct to break down the door, told me everything. Maybe she didn't know the specifics of the secret, but she knew there was a secret. She had spent her entire life guarding a tomb without knowing what body it held. My work wasn't just about honoring Robert's wish anymore. It was about liberating a truth she had held hostage for 75 years. A simple leak to the press wouldn't do. That could be dismissed as the slander of a bitter, disinherited widow. The proof was strong, but her power to create a narrative was stronger. No, the reveal had to be unimpeachable. It had to be public. It had to be theatrical. The setting had to be a character in the play. And there was only one possible stage. The annual Vance Historical Society Gala. The gala was Eleonora's coronation. Every year she hosted it at the mansion, standing before the community as the living embodiment of Vance history and benevolence. It was her masterpiece of public relations, her sacred performance. And I was going to bring the curtain down. I couldn't be the one to do it. My presence would invalidate the message. I needed a proxy, a Trojan horse. And the best Trojan horse is one that doesn't know it's carrying soldiers, the Historical Society itself. For the next month, I worked. I used a portion of the trust fund to hire a documents expert to verify the age of the paper and ink. I had him write up a formal, notarized attestation of their authenticity. Then I carefully packaged the original documents, the photograph, and the expert's report. I wrote an anonymous cover letter, typing it on an old manual typewriter I bought at a thrift store. The letter was from the perspective of a concerned local historian who had discovered this lost chapter of Vance family history at an estate sale. The letter praised Eleonora for her lifelong dedication to historical preservation and presented these documents as a new, vital addition to the family archives, one so important it deserved to be unveiled at the gala itself. It was a poisoned apple, polished to a perfect shine. I arranged for a courier to deliver the package to the president of the Historical Society, a pompous, self-important academic named Dr. Alistair Finch, at precisely 6 p.m. on the night of the gala. The instructions were clear. This was a surprise gift to be presented to the Society's patron, Mrs. Eleanora Vance, during his keynote address. The temptation of being the one to reveal such a bombshell discovery to a captive audience of the town's elite would be irresistible to a man like Finch. The night of the gala, I didn't go near the mansion. I stayed in my apartment, my war room. My revenge would be delivered remotely. I had one asset on the inside, a young waiter I'd hired for the night, a university student whose only job was to place his phone, streaming live, on a discreet shelf in the ballroom. For $200, he was my eyes and ears. I watched the live feed, my heart a slow, steady beat. I saw the guests arrive. I saw Eleonora, a queen in her court, greeting everyone with that serene, regal smile. She was dressed in deep emerald velvet, the famous Vance emeralds at her throat. She was the picture of untouchable grace. My hand went to the documents still on my desk, not the originals, but the high-resolution scans. I looked at the death certificate, then back at the woman on my screen, a ghost who had stolen a life, a name, a history. At 9 p.m., Dr. Finch took the stage. He launched into a fawning tribute to Eleonora, praising her as a pillar of historical integrity. Then, he held up my package, and tonight, he announced, his voice booming with self-importance, we have a most extraordinary surprise. A gift delivered just this evening from an anonymous donor. A lost piece of the Vance family archives, which it is now my distinct honor to share with you all for the very first time. He opened the package. He put on his reading glasses. The camera phone was positioned perfectly. I could see Eleonora in the front row, a look of pleasant, regal curiosity on her face. She thought this was for her. A tribute. Finch began to read from my cover letter. Then he picked up the first document. The birth record. He read the names, the date. Then he picked up the second. The death certificate. His voice, so confident moments before, began to falter. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. I could see him shuffle the papers, his eyes scanning the page, his academic mind trying to process the contradiction. He looked up from the page, his face pale, a bead of sweat on his temple. He looked at Eleonora, a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truth. He didn't know what to do. The silence in the ballroom stretched for an eternity. He cleared his throat and, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he read the crucial line from the adoption record. He didn't read the whole thing. He just said the words, "The private adoption of an ewe,